welcome to the next edition of Reclaiming My Mind. I am your host, Jessica Vaughn, and today I have with us a municipal candidate for City Council, District 3.
Correct.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Our guest is John Dingfelder.
Very good.
Okay. I want to make sure I pronounce that correctly. So thanks again for joining us, John. We are definitely trying to give our listeners a chance to learn as much about our city council and our mayoral candidates as possible. So the very first thing I like to do before we jump into the nuts and bolts of campaigns and platforms is learn more about you as a person.
Sure.
So if you don't mind telling me a little bit about yourself and your background so people get to know you.
Okay. Well, my name is John Dingfelder, and I'm a native born Tampano, or whoever we want to call ourselves these days. I was born here.
Wow.
My parents came to town in 1954 after my dad was finished his service in the military, and they settled here a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through grade school here. My folks split up, so I ended up going to junior high and high school in New Jersey, which for my development was, except for my parents splitting up, was probably a good thing. My mother took us up north, which is where she was from. My dad stayed here, and they both remarried. So every summer I would come back to Tampa. So I've got a little bit of both in me. I got a little bit of Yankee from my mom's side, and from living up there and going to high school up there, and then I came back to Florida every summer. And then when I decided to come to college, came back to the University of Florida for undergrad. Went to Virginia Tech for a graduate degree, and then came back to law school at the University of Florida again.
Oh, another lawyer.
Yes, and a double gator. I did a little stint in Tallahassee too, so I can go either way, Seminole or Gator. So. But anyway, so got married, started having a couple of kids.
So you're a lawyer at this point?
Correct.
What kind of law did you practice?
That's not an easy answer because I've done a lot of different areas of law in my career, which has actually, I think, been very helpful in a lot of ways. My practice right now, I've done 3 different stints in the public defender's office, and I'm back in the public defender's office. Oh. I work for Julianne Holt, the public defender for Hillsborough County. And previously, when I was in the public defender's office, I did the typical work. I represented accused felons, and we'd go to trial, and a lot of times you'd lose, or they'd take a plea, and you'd kind of waive, and they'd go to prison, and it's important work, but sometimes it's a little on the depressing side. Just because it's kind of like we're not really helping people; we're just sort of sending them to prison as a society.
Sure.
And but it was my job to make sure that everybody, had their fair trial, et cetera, et cetera. This time, Ms. Holt hired me to work in 2 different courts, which are alternative courts. I'm working in the mental health court, and I'm working in veterans court. And in the mental health court, as it sounds, we get folks who, let's say that, their family calls up and they need to Baker Act, their 25-year-old son who's having an episode. The police show up and the son starts thrashing about and hits the cop. Well, the next thing you know, you've gone from a Baker Act to a 3rd-degree felony because he smacked the cop. Well, obviously nobody's happy about an officer being hit, but at the same time, now you've got a person who's potentially going off to prison for this, sort of irrational act, while they're sort of, in a state. So we bring them into our court and we get them treatment. And it's a wonderful thing. We get them mental health treatment. We get them their medication. Sometimes we get them residential treatment if they need residential. The state of Florida and Hillsborough County governments are participating and funding this court. And it's it's a wonderful sort of experiment.
Right.
Because it's relatively new. And I'm also doing veterans court. And in a very similar way, we take our veterans out of the main court system, whether or not it's a DUI or some more serious felony, and we bring them into veterans court. A lot of them have PTSD. They have drug and alcohol issues often associated with their service in Afghanistan or Iraq or what have you, and they come back kind of traumatized, and then they self-medicate. So again, we give them treatment. We work with the VA hospital. Most of them have some VA benefits or get VA benefits through the system, and we're able to treat them typically for about a year, and then after a year, of diversion, this is all diversionary court, their charges are dismissed. And the same thing with mental health court. We get their charges dismissed if they successfully complete the diversion program. So I'm just really excited to be there and have the opportunity to, like I say, do people some good instead of like just a highway to prison.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds like a much better end to be on. Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. You got your degree, you came back, you started having children.
Yeah, so, backing up a little bit. So I made a very conscious decision to come back to Tampa. My ex-wife and I, looked around. She was from Orlando. I was from Tampa. We pretty much knew we wanted to settle somewhere in Florida. But I made a conscious decision to come to Tampa and Hillsborough County because this is a place I love. I was born here. I love this community. It's grown and changed a lot, but I think it's still a great place to live. And so I raised my kids here in Tampa. They went to public schools, well-educated, good, solid citizens, and now they're grown. And in the meantime, right around when they were in, I'd say high school-ish, I started getting involved in our community. I've always been involved in the community. I was a Little League coach and I was a PTA dad and that sort of thing. But as they got a little bit older, I had a little bit more time, and I started actually getting involved with my neighborhood association. I became president of my neighborhood association, and that kind of led to an appointment to serve on the variance board. The variance board, of course, is a zoning board to make decisions whether or not somebody wants to build their house a little bit closer to the street or put in a swimming pool that's a little bit close to the property line or what have you. They come to the variance board and we make those decisions. And I served on the variance board for 3-4 years, and people would watch me on the variance board, come up to me in the grocery store, and they'd say, "John, you're really good at that." And I'd say, "Well, I have, my legal training." And they'd say, "Yeah, but you have common sense." And I appreciated that. And they encouraged me to run for city council. And so in 2003, I ran successfully for city council. I served on city council 2003 to 2007. I ran for re-election in 2007 and served another 3.5 years, almost 2 full terms on city council.
So normally what I would ask guests is, what makes you want to run for city council? But you've already ran for city council and served terms. So what makes you want to run again?
Right. So I've been out for a couple of years. I haven't just been sitting around. I've been doing some really neat stuff, which we can talk about whenever you wish. But, again, it's the same reason I ran and served before. It turns out that public service is in my blood. Whether or not it's, like I say, being in the public defender's office. I did a stint in the county attorney's office. I managed to find the lowest paying lawyer jobs in town.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. But I, like I say, I love this community. I love giving back. And my dad was always into community service and public service. And so I think I give him shout outs and kudos. And I'm blessed to still have both my parents. And but anyway, so it's in my blood. I love public service. I really enjoyed serving on city council. And again, without sounding smug or arrogant, I was good at it. And so I'm going to go back and take the experience and knowledge and wisdom and skills and take those back to council to use the vision that I have to move this community forward.
So let's talk a little bit about, because normally when I have people who are incumbents on, we talk about their challenges that they faced and some of the biggest things that they are the most proud of while they serve.
Sure.
And I want to know that about you as well. But tell me a little bit about what you think will be different this time, how the board has changed, how our city has changed, what you anticipate to be different from when you served compared to now.
Okay. I served with some fine people, and I want to put that in as a caveat at the beginning because there is a but there. But I served with some fine people, and they're all honorable, good good people. When I first went on board, Linda Salsena and I were the two, I would say, more progressive council members.
Okay.
And it was great. I mean, Linda loved it that I was there because she used to be the lone progressive voice on council. And then when I came along, at least she was able to get her motions seconded so there could be some discussion about whatever it is that she wanted to do. And then, of course, when I came on board, when I had ideas, she would second my ideas, and we could at least have a discussion about them.
Sure.
Unfortunately, a lot of times, and I'll give you some concrete examples, but a lot of times our ideas would, die. I'd make a motion, she'd second it, they'd call a vote on our idea, and it'd die, 4-3 or 5-2. Then subsequently, we got Mary Mulhern on board. Again, a good, strong, progressive voice, and Mary and I served together, and then there were three of us, But again, it was difficult to make anything happen, And I look over across the bay at St. Pete City Council, which has, at least a majority, and if not more, progressives, and they're actually doing some really neat stuff.
Right.
And, so it's a little disappointing because, for example, when I was on council, toward the end of my second term, I made a motion, and Linda seconded it, to have campaign finance reform. In Sarasota, they had campaign finance reform where they actually limited contributions to $100 per person or per corporation.
Right.
That's a big difference from, well, at that time it was a $500 limit, but now it's a $1,000 limit. And I don't like money in politics. And, and somebody will quickly point and look at my campaign report and see that I have $500 and $1,000 contributions. Well, I'm going to play in whatever game, whatever hand is dealt, that's what I'm going to play in. So right now, that's the rules. And, yes, I'm not going to self-impose a penalty on myself, with $100 limits. However, when I get back to city council, I'm again going to make that motion, do my research and make the motion and see if we can amend the charter, or whatever it takes by ordinance or by charter to have a campaign finance reform and limit contributions. And the reason I say that, I'm sort of running on, but if you're interested, the reason I think that's really important is because I think some people get discouraged when there's too much. The appearance of too much money in politics, whether or not it's at the national, state, or local level, and they go, well, that's just a game for rich people or rich companies that invest and spend their $1,000, and they buy these politicians. Blah, blah, blah. I can never be bought for no matter what. If it's $1,000 or $1 million, I'm not going to be bought. But that's the perception.
Sure.
And, if we can reduce that and kind of level the playing field, so, Joe or Sally in the neighborhood who might be able to come up with $100 contribution has the feeling that they have the same power and the same contribution as that, the big company that's building a huge development in downtown Tampa.
Sure. You want to level the playing field.
Yeah. And anyway, so that's just the kind of thing that, that I proposed on city council. You asked me about frustrations.
Sure.
Sometimes we get frustrated.
Being the minority.
Being the voting minority. We had sort of, I won't call it a conservative board when I was on the two different boards I was on, but definitely nobody was out there looking to push the envelope.
Right.
Except for, like I say, myself or Linda or Mary.
So what do you feel? It sounds like you have four? Is it three or four other candidates?
Three opponents in my race.
So there are four opponents altogether. Yeah. What would you say differentiates you from your opponents?
Experience. Our yard sign used to say common sense. because, that's what people said to us.
Right.
But it's funny because now when I go in the grocery store and I say, and I've told people over the last 6 months that I was running, and people say, "Oh, that's great. We could really use your experience back on council." And I don't fault my three opponents. They're all good people. They bring, they bring something to the table in terms of their own personal experience. But I've got many years of life experience, and more importantly, council experience. I don't think it can be replaced. And I have to say that there's a bit of a void right now in regard to council, because if you look at who's coming and who's leaving, the only two council members who are incumbents who are running for reelection is Luis Vieira, from District 7, and Guido Maniscalco of District 6.
What about in John Godwin's race?
Excuse me, and Charlie Miranda. So Charlie Miranda is he's in a class of his own. He's got 24 years experience, something like that. But in terms of Guido, is a good guy and has done a good job. He's only been there 4 years,
right?
And Lewis only been there for 2 years,
right?
So, if and when I go back onto city council, all of a sudden I bring back 8 years of experience, and it's not just say I have experience, but with that experience is institutional knowledge. With that experience is sort of a wisdom to be able to say, you know what, we tried X, Y, and Z, but let's try A, B, and C next time, because X, Y, and Z didn't work. And if you don't have that sort of institutional knowledge there, you can kind of stumble and go backwards when really we don't have time to go backwards.
Sure.
We need to go forwards and use this opportunity when the economy's good and that sort of thing, to move our city forward. We don't have time to tread water and have a learning curve. And when I get elected, I hit the ground running.
So let's talk a little bit then, if you have a vision with your institutional knowledge about your platform and your vision for Tampa, especially with the understanding of what you can and cannot do as being a city council member.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit about your platform.
Well, I like to break it down topic by topic, if that's okay.
Sure.
If we have the time. I think two of the most important issues right now are transportation and transit,
right,
and affordable housing.
Those do seem to be the two most important issues.
It's what people talk about to us.
Sure.
Whether or not we're in the grocery store or at some of these candidate forums and that sort of thing.
Right.
There's obviously a lot of other important issues. Infrastructure and many other things, just generally good government and ethics, and those are very important issues as well. But we'll talk about transit and transportation first.
Sure.
Like I say, I have seen this city and this county and this region, just multiplied tremendously. I recall, I think my dad and I were talking about the other day. When this whole city stopped at the city limits, and it had 250,000 people, and that was it. And now it's busting at the seams and sprawling into 6-7 counties, depending on how you want to look at it.
Right.
We can look at the pros or cons of all that, but frankly, a lot of that's out of our control. But the bottom line is the city of Tampa is the core of all of that. Granted, St. Petersburg is coming along, and they're doing pretty well. So we sort of share that. But at the end of the day, this area grew around Tampa as its hub, and as a result, I believe that it's inherently important that we start a transit system from Tampa and build out. That's the way I've seen it in numerous other cities that I've been to for decades, including Atlanta and DC, et cetera, is, you don't just build a transit system, you started at the core and you build it out. So what does that mean? Well, I believe we have to start with a with some type of transit system. And I don't know exactly what the technology is going to be because the technologies are changing. And I'm a lot of things, but I'm not an engineer. But I do believe we have to have a path, a high-speed path to get from downtown up the Kennedy corridor, whether or not it's Cypress or Kennedy or whatever. Again, I'm not going to command those details. That's why we have engineers.
Sure.
But anyway, to get from downtown to the airport, and then we need to go from downtown out to the USF and maybe the new Tampa area, depending. And we need to be able to move people, and then eventually we can have another line, that goes down into South Tampa, and then so that's your core. That's where we start, and then once that's successful, then we branch off from there. We don't just start with a transit system, though. I'm so excited that this community finally got around to passing the referendum.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have the funds to do the things we've been talking about for 20 years.
Right.
I've been part of that discussion. When I was on city council, again, my experience wasn't just on council, but I also served as a member of the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a critical part of the design and build and plan and using federal monies and that sort of thing to make these things happen. I was also part of the Heartline board and part of the Trolley board. So on all three of those boards, we'd have these great people and these great engineers and with a lot of vision and youth and excitement, talking about, let's say the trolley, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been 10, 15 years since we had a plan that said, let's extend the trolley north.
Right.
And it shouldn't be stopping all the way down there by the convention center.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to go up through the heart of downtown. It needs to continue into Heights. And if I had it my way and we had the money to do it, continue it all the way up into Seminole Heights.
Absolutely.
That's where the trolley used to be, 70 years ago before they ripped the rails out and we had to fall back to the automobile. So, so serving on those boards, we had plans, we had great ideas, but we never had the money.
Sure.
Now we've got the money to fund these things. And I just think it's a super exciting time to go back to city council, to go back onto those boards. And I hope I hope I'm selected and able to serve on the MPO and serve on HART. And again, use my experience from before, but now we've got the money to make these things happen.
Do you think that we should use the existing rail tracks like a lot of the municipal candidates do?
I think that if we can negotiate with CSX and get a reasonable deal to be able to do that, I think that it makes logical sense. With the least amount of impact, especially in terms of getting up to the USF area. I know there's discussions whether or not you should do it, up Nebraska or up Florida and that sort of thing. And I'm not totally sold. I think I'm a good listener, and like I say, I'm not an engineer. And so I'd like to hear, a lot of expert opinions in that regard. But I think the CSX corridor is definitely one of the very viable options if we can negotiate a good deal with CSX. Same thing in regard to getting down into South Tampa. You can go all the way down to Port Tampa, which is the bottom end down by MacDill Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. If on that CSX rail line, just cuts, right there parallel with the expressway. And, so it sort of makes logical sense. And there's also some good sort of opportunities for TOD, the transit-oriented development, at various intersections. So when that rail line's coming up through South Tampa, it crosses right there near Dale Mabry, it's Himes Avenue. But anyway, right near Dale Mabry behind Britton Plaza, perfect TOD opportunity there. When it goes up a little further, Bay to Bay, MacDill, again, it crosses right around there. Perfect opportunity for transit-oriented development, which for listeners who might not know, basically is in order to support a line like that, you need greater intensity and density. I took a field trip up to Charlotte several years ago, and And they showed us, these apartment complexes would sprout up along, within a quarter mile, half mile of the station. So it's just like, if you build it, they will come. If you build that station, you get some higher density. And that's what you need to support the rail. So it's sort of a chicken and egg.
So when we're talking about that leads us to the second thing we were discussing, affordable housing. What are your thoughts on, when you talk about it being in your platform, the crisis that we're having with affordable housing statewide, but specifically in Tampa?
Well, it is a crisis. It's a crisis for many reasons. It actually ties into our transit problem, because when people are forced to live further and further away from their jobs, so let's say people who work at the airport, not at huge wages, and they have to, it used to be maybe they lived in West Tampa in a modest house in West Tampa. That modest house for $70,000 is now $200,000 or $250,000. So now they got to, go further and further out and, into Pasco County or across the bridge into Pinellas Park and Pinellas County or somewhere, that is more affordable for them.
Right.
Well, what does that result in? It results in a lot more trips and a lot more hours of them in their vehicle. Mm-hmm. And that's not healthy for us as a community. Our roads are clogged with everybody going everywhere because they're not living close to where they work. But it's also not healthy for that individual or that family, mm-hmm. because if mom or dad are away from the kids because have to drive an hour each way to work, then who's watching the kids? And just it's a healthier family unit if you don't have to commute that far. But just the bottom line on that family and their week to week checkbook, and if they used to be able to pay $700 for rent or something like that, and now they're paying twice that. That's a real problem.
So what's the answer to it?
Well, there's no simple answer.
Right.
I do believe that years ago, Mayor Sandy Friedman, who was now about, 3 mayors back, but she had a program called the Challenge Fund. Mm-hmm. I don't know if any of the other candidates have talked about it. They haven't. But, under the Mayor's Challenge Fund, what Sandy did was she was able to leverage city dollars, mm-hmm. and some federal HUD money, also working with the Housing Authority because they have money too, and they have access to money. And then she teamed up with nonprofits, and that was critical. She teamed up with nonprofits and also financial lending institutions. So, for example, and what happened was the city, in conjunction with all these other organizations, would be the guarantor. Okay, so if somebody was a first-time home buyer, let's say they could afford a $200,000 home in West Tampa. Okay, two incomes, two modest incomes, let's say teacher incomes, that sort of thing. They can probably afford a modest home in West Tampa or East Tampa for maybe a little bit less. And but what are they missing? They're probably missing the ability to put that $5,000 or $10,000, $15,000 down payment. Well, the city would help people with their down payment. And they wouldn't make them pay it right back. As a matter of fact, a lot of times they would defer that repayment of that down payment until the people sold their house. So if that's your starter home, you're in there 10, 15 years. The city has a lien on that, so the city doesn't get screwed out of that $10,000 or $15,000, and everybody's good with that. The lenders, et cetera, they help people get in. They have classes, just like Habitat for Humanity has classes, mm-hmm. to help people get into these homes and help them make sure that your mortgage has to be the first thing you pay at the beginning of each month, and you have to teach people that if they've never been homeowners. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's what the city did under Mayor Friedman. I think we should recreate that type of program. And I also think we need a goal. I think as a city, we talk about affordable housing, but I haven't seen any mayor or council person say, this is our goal. Well, my goal, which I'm going to propose to the next mayor and to city council, is that we build 1,000, new homes and or affordable homes, attainable homes, and or, doesn't have to be single family homes. It could be multifamily, but 1,000 within the 4-year period that we're in. So that gives us a goal of 250, affordable homes every year during the next 4 years of my term.
So here's my question, and I've gotten different answers to it from different candidates because everything's super complicated. Can a city council decide when they're allowing developers or giving permits or deciding who develops? Can they put in clauses or can they mandate so much of the development has to be geared towards affordable housing? How much control does city council have when they're allowing development to happen to prioritize affordable housing?
I haven't asked for a legal opinion on that, although I am a lawyer. And I've done land use law earlier in my career. Mm-hmm. When I was in the county attorney's office, I did some land use law, and I used to give advice to the Board of County Commissioners on these types of issues. I haven't looked specifically at that issue. In the past, we have tried to create incentives. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, it was an ordinance that I was part of and voted on in the Channelside area. So it was kind of we would give density bonuses. So in other words, if that property, that 1 square block of property in Channelside might have the ability under the current code to build, let's say, 100 units under the existing code and the existing zoning and the existing height limitations, then we would say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Developer, by the way, if you want a density bonus and you can get to 120 units, if you do some of the following, mm-hmm. And the quid pro quo there was, for example, if they put in a dog park, mm-hmm. We might give them a little bonus. If they put in some affordable housing units, we would give them a density bonus. Mm. And then I wrote another ordinance, which is the City of Tampa Green Ordinance, which has already been on the books because I wrote it myself, and it was voted on by the council that I was on. It got watered down a little bit by the administration, which was a little disappointing. But one of the things we did in my Green Ordinance is we gave a bonus if people developed with the LEED certified development standards, which, as you know, is basically to reduce the carbon footprint of that, not only the building itself while it's operating, but during construction and before, during, and after construction, the whole LEED program would kick in and reduce the carbon footprint. So those are the kind of things that we did the last time I was on council. And if I have a good council to work with, I'm going to pass those kind of ordinances and strengthen them all over again. If we have the ability from a legal, to answer your question, if we have the ability from a legal perspective to demand that, developments of a certain size, because it'd be really hard, I think, if somebody came in and they say, okay, I want to build a duplex. Right. And then we'd say, well, yeah, we want one of those 2 units to be affordable. That's not necessarily realistic. Right. And then we just have people not wanting to build. Right. But I think at a certain threshold, maybe 10 units, 15 units, something like that, at a certain threshold, I think it is realistic to say, Mr. Developer, Mrs. Developer, set aside, 10% of that building, for affordable or attainable housing. And then we have to define what that means. Right. And that's a moving target too. Well,
as someone who lives in the city, what I'm concerned with and what I see is, beautiful restoration and gentrifying of so many of our historic neighborhoods, but with that, it's just the displacement of marginalized communities and low income communities or elderly communities that, as we have this affordable housing crisis, have nowhere to go. So I guess what I look for when I'm talking to candidates and what I think other people are looking for is an answer to this displacement that comes with gentrifying so much of Tampa.
Right.
So I would be interested. I think people would be definitely interested in understanding, how we make sure that as developers grow, we're making sure that we have availability for, people who need that kind of affordable housing. So I think that's why it's on the forefront of everybody, is because we're slowly watching Tampa not have anywhere to offer people, who, like you said, can't afford to own at the very minimum a $200,000 house, and minimum wage is $7. So how much do you even have to make to? So that we'll move on to that regarding minimum wage.
If you have a second on that, I wanted to give a very tangible example of that. Did I mention I used to teach school? I think I mentioned that.
I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, anyway, I took 3 years off and I taught school. The school board, I said, what do you want me to teach? You want me to teach law? You want me to teach social studies? And well, they looked at my background. I had a science background. And they said, we need science teachers, especially men, in middle school. So I went to
and that's still the case today, just so you know.
Okay, I went to Booker T. Washington, which is right there on Nebraska and Ybor City, and I taught 2 years of science there, and then I went and taught a year of high school algebra before our family was so broke and starving I had to go back to law. But anyway, I love teaching. I would have kept doing it, except sadly enough, it doesn't pay enough. But anyway, the point being is half of my students were from Central Park Village. Central Park Village is now, they leveled the whole thing subsequently.
That was down by North Boulevard downtown?
Not North Boulevard. Central Park Village is where Encore is.
Okay.
You know where the Encore development is?
I think so.
Right just above downtown near the railroad station. And it was a horrible project / slum, okay? But people lived there in affordable housing. I mean, it was just like a miserable place, and it was sort of classic projects, and it had crime, and it had all sorts of bad issues. And half of the students that I was teaching were from there. So I used to, go home with them because their parents wouldn't necessarily come for conferences. So I'd walk home with the kids and have a conference on the front yard, So I knew it very well. Well, now the Housing Authority went in there 10 years ago, leveled the whole thing, which is probably a good thing because it really needed leveling. And they built this Encore project, and the reason I mentioned the Encore project is the Encore project is a mixture of market rate housing in the same building as some affordable housing.
Right.
And because it's owned and operated, most of it, I think, by the Tampa Housing Authority, they have a mandate, from the federal government. They're not just going to go in there and level it and build market rate housing. They have to have a mixture, and hopefully the goal was that some of those people who were displaced out of Central Park, had an opportunity to go back into this new Encore project. I haven't followed up to see if that happened.
Right.
But when I'm back on council, I definitely will.
Awesome. Let's move on to some of the other issues I want to talk about, because we could talk all night.
I probably could.
In that vein, I ask all of the candidates about different issues that, as the president of the Progressive Caucus, are important to me and my listeners. And one of the ones that I've been surprised at, because I've gotten a lot, I feel like the candidates have become more progressive, which is great. But one thing I've gotten a lot of pushback on that I was surprised of is raising minimum wage to $15 an hour. Even on the national level, the Democratic Party has started to accept that concept and push for that. But it seems like in Tampa, especially as a council person, that would be a challenge, because it seems like Tampa City Council is headed towards a budget crisis, that the budget has been leaner and leaner each year, and that in a couple of years something comes up where some bonds or something comes up and the budget's going to be even more tight. And that trying to pay all of just the city workers, $15 an hour, not even talking about people who don't work for the city, just isn't in the budget. So tell me a little bit about your thoughts on minimum wage and how that coincides with a possible, tighter budget and budget crisis we might be facing as city council approaches this event that's gonna, I'm not exactly sure what the event is, if the bonds are coming up. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, there are some bonds coming due and have to be paid down and paid off and that sort of thing. And it's a serious issue. But I think minimum wage is a very serious issue. And I've been on the record, and I'm glad to be on the record with you, to say that I would support a $15 minimum wage for all city employees. I have great concern for city employees. I need to explore and see how many are below $15 an hour right now.
Right.
But it doesn't matter to me, because that's been determined to be a living wage. Now, I think it might take us maybe a year or two to get there. I don't think we can do it overnight. And that's not just about the city wages, the city employee wages. And by the way, I've got the endorsement of so far most of the city unions. The ATU has endorsed me. The teachers have endorsed me. The AFL-CIO Central Labor has endorsed me, and the firefighters have endorsed me recently.
Yeah, the unions just came out with a big set of announcements.
Right.
It seems
and tomorrow
like
I interview with PBA and the law enforcement. So we'll see where that goes. But the point is obviously law enforcement, they're not making $15 an hour. This impacts janitors and people like that. No, I totally commit to it. But the other really important component of that is, because if you look at the city employees, we have 4,000 or 5,000 city employees. That's a very small part of the total workplace. So the question is what can we do as a city council, as a city government to raise the tide for all employees in the city? And the first thing we can do is tell the contractors who earn their money out of the city coffers, whether or not they're, road construction contractors or they're selling us toilet paper or who knows what. Right. Those contractors are, that's who we also need to enforce that $15 an hour. Now, I would say we probably need to start out at, maybe $12 an hour and work our way up for the next couple of years, because we don't want like total panic and then somebody's paying their workers, let's say $10 an hour today, and now tomorrow I pass an ordinance that says, by the way, you have to jack that up $5 extra. Right. I think that could have some really harsh impacts, and then they might lay people off. We don't want that. Sure. But I commit that over the next couple of years, we would get to $15 an hour. I have an interesting little anecdote, and if you have a couple of minutes, about how much I care for those employees at the city at that level. And when I say that level, basically at the bottom rung of the city ladder. Several years ago, and I was serving underneath a mayor that I won't name by name, and we were in the middle of the recession. And she tasked her chief of staff and said, we need to find areas where we can cut. Yes, we all agreed. We needed to find areas where we could cut. Well, they came back to us and they said, we want to privatize these 50 to 70 employees. We want to privatize them. Basically, we want to lay them off and let them go out into the private workforce and replace them with, a company, a for-profit company. And that company, we hope, will hire those people back as private employees. And guess what? Without benefits anymore, they'd lose their city health benefits, they'd lose their city pension benefits, et cetera. And they'd probably make $2 or $3 less. Right. But it amounted to a savings to the city of a few $100,000. And now, a lot of times a mayor can get away with that because we do have a strong mayor form of government. That's what I hear. A mayor can get away with that sort of thing without ever coming to city council. However, in this one case, they had to come back to city council because they had to bring this contract, with the private company that was going to replace. They had to bring it to us first before they laid off all those people. These people, it turned out, were the park janitors, the various people who cleaned City Hall, et cetera, on the bottom rung of the city ladder, earning, they were earning, let's say at the time, $10, $11, $12 an hour, something like that. Doesn't sound like much to us, but to them, it was huge. So I told the mayor at that time, I said, this isn't a good idea, and I'm going to fight this. Personally, I'm going to fight this. And I took this on as a cause. And and that mayor said, no, John, I understand you care for these people, but we need to make these cuts. And I said, really? I said, are you going up higher up into the ladder, into mid-management and senior management? Right. Are you making cuts there? Oh, no, we can't do that. That would be disruptive. Well, this is disruptive on these people's lives. Bottom line is I went down and I found out who these people were and where they lived. Okay, not because I'm nosy, but because who they were. Well, it turns out that about 80% of those workers who were about to be laid off were Hispanic and African American. Okay, and I found out where they lived because I mailed them a letter. And I said, dear sir or ma'am, you're about to lose your job. If you care about losing your job, which I'm sure you do, please come down to City Hall on such and such a day, because we're going to be discussing that issue. And about 20 of them, and then I worked with the union too to encourage people to show up. And about 20 of them showed up, and they argued their own case to council. I just had to shut up and sit back for a change. And just watch it happen. And it unfolded so beautifully because these people told their story about how, maybe they were an immigrant, if they were Hispanic, they were an immigrant or whatever. And this was a great job for them. They raised their children doing this. They sent their child was the first one to go to college on this city salary. And by the way, they couldn't afford to lose their healthcare benefits, because somebody in the family had been sick, et cetera, et cetera. They told their story to council, and council responded and said, oh my God, we can't lay these people off. And I got, I think, a 6-1 vote to reject the private contract and to save those people's jobs.
That's a good story.
And it was in the paper and everything else. People can Google it up. But
I don't mean to imply that it's just a story.
No, I know that. But I it's really one of the proudest moments that I had during that whole thing, because it had such a huge impact on these 50 families. And I still to this day have parks people waving and beeping at me, saying, thank you so much. And they're still on board. Great.
It's good to hear a commitment to everybody equally. That's always something that we're looking for when we're talking to different candidates. So let's run down some of the issues a little more quickly, just to get kind of a little feel. The lightning round. I love that. Just to kind of get a feel for where you stand on things. So there's a huge initiative to get expanded Medicare on the ballot right now.
Sure.
Luis Vieira has been personally kind of taking up that fight and doing much to get people signing those petitions. Would you say that you are a proponent of Medicare for all, and do you think healthcare is a human right?
Oh, absolutely. And I signed the petition and be glad to put forth a resolution to that effect when we get on council this spring. And do everything we can. We have, if we have, it looks like it's going to have to be by initiative. So we'll push the initiative as hard as we can.
How about adult use marijuana? Would you say that you're a proponent of legalizing adult use marijuana in Florida?
I think at this point, and we've seen around the nation, there's nothing. We need to decriminalize marijuana and just. It's fine in Washington State and Colorado and probably another dozen states around the country, and Florida needs to get on board.
And what about...
by the way, I had somebody in the public that I represented in the public defender's office, and they violated their probation because they had a marijuana joint in their pocket. Now, their original crime was serious, but they were on probation, and they violated the probation because a marijuana cigarette was in their pocket. And the judge sent them back to prison for another 6 years.
Wow.
Okay. So because of this joint in their pocket.
Mm-hmm. What about LGBTA rights? I know that, like, I think it was Guido or someone took the stance to kind of ban the gay conversion therapy. So we definitely want to make sure that we have people who are proponents of LGBTA rights. Would you say that that's a cause that's something you would fight for?
Yeah, and I've been fighting for it and with the LGBT community for probably 2 decades. When I was in the county attorney's office, there's a gentleman in this community called David Caton, and he had an organization called Take Back Tampa. It sounded really good, and it was really horrific because basically it was a homophobic organization. And at the time, the city of Tampa had just passed a human rights ordinance with a lot of protections for gays and lesbians, and that was very progressive 20 years ago. And I think it was under Sandy Friedman. But immediately, Mr. Caton and his homophobes from the East County came running in to try and get that defeated. I was part of a team with County Attorney Acton, and we went up to the Florida Supreme Court and won that case. And to this day, the human rights ordinance is still on the books for the city of Tampa.
All right. The next thing I wanted to ask about is gun reform, because I was looking over your Progressive Caucus application, and we ask a lot of questions about gun reform. Our president is very, very, very interested in gun reform. And I noticed the only thing that you didn't really check off was repealing the Stand Your Ground. I'm
glad you caught that. No, I mean, I'm totally in favor of gun reform. I can't believe in my lifetime the proliferation of guns and it's kind of like even my brother-in-law, armed himself recently. It's like, why? It's like, what are we doing?
Right.
But it's just horrific. And I have no problem with people with hunting rifles that are, that's a legitimate thing. They want to hunt. That's their prerogative. And that's what I believe was the original motivation for the Second Amendment, that and, the militia, but now we have National Guard, I think, instead of the door-to-door militia. But anyway, totally in favor of all aspects of gun reform that you mentioned on your thing in terms of gun show loopholes and magazines, multiple magazines, et cetera, all those things we need to get rid of if we can at any level. When the Stand Your Ground thing, I guess I just had a little professional hiccup on that as a public defender, because we use Stand Your Ground as a legitimate defense. Sometimes you've got, gang shootings out in a parking lot, none of which is a good thing, and nobody should be involved in it. But sometimes our clients get shot at and then return fire. So that's using Stand Your Ground. I know it sounds horrible, but just on a professional level, I didn't want to be hypocritical, especially to the people in my office who rely on Stand Your Ground. Okay.
Well, I'm glad I got to ask you about that as well, because I know that our board will have questions. Another thing I wanted to ask about was, you kind of mentioned it already as far as environmental talking about our carbon footprint and how you wrote, a green ordinance. But a lot of our listeners just want to, get a feel for how committed to environmental rights and conserving, our natural resources. And also through these conversations, we've talked so much about how Tampa is becoming one of the most vulnerable cities to stormwater surge and how vulnerable we are with MacDill Air Force Base and Tampa General. And so what would you say, now that if you're coming back on council, would be your focus as far as conservation and environmental rights are concerned?
Well, I've always had a conservation environmental leaning. I used to be on the board of the Tampa Audubon. I just believe in it strongly. In terms of reducing our footprint, I made some efforts, passing the green ordinance, also pushing our procurement process. I was noticing we were just doing the same old, in terms of buying vehicles. I said, well, you know what? There's this thing called hybrid vehicles, and they save a lot of gas, and therefore that's a good thing, and use battery power where we can. Now, obviously, we can, go 100% electric,
right.
With our fleet, and I would push for that. Not only with the city fleet, but if I'm on the HART board, I would totally support, Commissioner Kemp and her efforts to make our buses, electric, and reduce our footprint. I think as a community, we have a place in the state and in the country and in the world. We have to. We can't be hypocritical about it. We can't just point to other people and other places. We have to start here and reduce our footprint here. And part of that is with transit. By the way, I didn't even talk about our bus fleet. We have an opportunity now with that money to build a robust, bus fleet. And that's what we need to start doing tomorrow, is to it's tragic that they were cutting bus routes and cutting bus times over the last couple of years because they didn't have any money. And I saw that coming when I was on HART. Now we have the money, and I'm confident that the county commissioner's lawsuit is going to fail, and we will have that money to build a robust bus fleet. My brother tells me that when we were very young, my dad used to take the bus, from our home in Palmacia to downtown. We had 2 cars. We had the big giant station wagon, and my mother, I guess, had a little Ford Falcon, as I recall. But for whatever reason, Dad took the bus. But then for whatever reason, he stopped taking the bus. Maybe the bus routes got weaker or something like that. I don't know.
Right.
But moms and dads, of all shapes, sizes, and colors, need to get back on the bus. And
what about the separation between church and state? Do you think that's important at all branches of government?
Well, it's a loaded question. As a former ACLU attorney, I did a year with the ACLU, the local Florida ACLU, and the local chapter of Tampa, and that was my job for a year, was to protect our freedoms. And one of those freedoms is to make sure that there's a very strong separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, I made what was perceived as a highly controversial move when I was on council to... the council always starts with an invocation from a very well-meaning, priest or pastor or minister or what have you. So one day I had a neighbor who was actually president of the Florida Atheists. And he said, "John, why do you guys do that?" And I said, "Well, it's just tradition, and that's what council does, and that's what they feel comfortable with," which is not a great answer. And he said, "I'm an atheist. Why can't I come down there and give the invocation?" And I said, "Sure, absolutely. Come on down."
Right.
And I invited him down, and it created this huge hubbub. And I think 4 of my fellow councilmen walked out on the meeting,
wow.
refusing to be talked to by an atheist or something like that. Yeah, it was like, and I'm not an atheist, although I like that ad on TV by Ronald Reagan Jr. But do you seen that ad?
Oh, no, I haven't watched TV.
Oh, well, yeah. Anyway, he says he's an atheist and he's willing to burn in hell or something.
Oh.
But I'm not an atheist, but I do believe in the civil rights and liberties that make this country so special. And that's why I represented the ACLU. I believe in protecting everybody's civil liberties, and including a strong separation of church and state.
So I only have 2 more questions for you, both kind of geared in line with what we're talking about. Since you said you've been a public school teacher, and I was looking over your endorsement, I did notice that you mentioned, that you do have a dedication to public schools and that you were against most voucher and charter schools. But also there was some question about zoning since you've been on zoning boards. So it was kind of hard to get a good feel. I am a certified public teacher. I sub in the school system right now. And, one of the things that really important to me is protecting public education from this privatization move.
Right.
So I always like to get a good feel for any elected official, especially since it's going to be interesting to see, how much power city has and in the upcoming years. Where would you say you stand when it comes to charter schools and all of that and privatization of education?
Right. I'm a product of public schools at every level, as is my wife. And as are our children. My children were very well prepared when they graduated Hillsborough County Public Schools, and they ended up, both going up north to Ivy League schools. So they were well prepared, with the gifts that they had personally, as well as the education they got in our public schools. I think public schools are absolutely critical to our society. I think we've come up with rationalizations and excuses as to why public schools were failing, and therefore that's how this charter school movement, got going. Vouchers and charter school movement got going, and now it seems to have some dangerous momentum.
Right.
It's not the answer. The answer is to take our money and improve our public schools, and actually give the public schools more money. And again, I'm thrilled that, the voters passed a referendum to help the structure, the physical structures and the air conditioning of those schools.
Right.
But we need to pay our teachers better. Now, all those core decisions, are made either at the state level or by the school board.
Right.
People, I kind of laugh when I see some city council candidates, talking about, quote, improving education. Well, that's just a lie, because that's not what city council does. Now, we can work with the school board, and we do work with the school board in terms of before school and after school programs at our rec centers.
Right.
And I'm totally in favor of that. And we need to expand that. I think that's something Mayor Bob did, and I think it's really good.
Now, would you make decisions for land development for charter schools and zoning permits?
Possibly. I don't recall specifically any during the 8 years that I was on city council, but it's possible that if an organization came in and they found a building and they wanted to rezone it for charter school and that sort of thing, that was your organization's question was, what could we? I think the insinuation was, if I'm against charter schools, can we use the zoning? The rezoning process to slow them down.
Right.
I think the answer, again, is probably maybe. That sounds like a lawyer. Maybe. Again, I haven't researched it specifically. I think there is a danger. The first day when I get sworn in, I raise my hand and I swear to uphold the laws of the state of Florida and in the United States. Well, that includes property rights. And
Sure.
So when you're doing rezonings, you have to be extremely careful of private property rights, and you have to be careful not to cross a line to impose sort of unrelated issues upon the zoning process. The danger is if you do, not only could you be violating somebody's constitutional rights or other rights, but you could also, as a city, get sued for doing that, and then you lose taxpayer money in that lawsuit.
Sure.
So, I take that, when I sit there as a zoning officer, it's what they call a quasi-judicial process, which basically means we sort of don the judicial robe, and I take that very seriously. So you have to, when the evidence comes in about that rezoning, you have to base your decision upon that competent, substantial evidence. Now, if somebody can prove that charter school is going to cause traffic problems that neighborhood otherwise didn't have, that's a really good basis to deny the rezoning.
Sure.
So in that case, I'm not in favor of charter schools. I think I could look for, some of the more common reasons of traffic or noise or I don't know what else, those types of reasons to deny that rezoning. But just to deny it on the basis that it might be a charter school or as opposed to a public school or something like that, I think you'd be on shaky legal grounds.
Sure. Well, that's a very thorough answer. My next question is, in regards to being citywide, right? Because you're running for a citywide seat, not district specific, is when we're talking about Tampa Bay and representing a lot of marginalized communities, communities of color, communities where there's a lot of working class and lower income constituents feel that they're underrepresented by all the politicians. And so I guess my question would be kind of a twofold question. As a citywide council member, how do you feel like you'd prioritize a lot of these communities that feel underrepresented and aren't getting the same resources as a lot of other communities? And two, how at the same time do you feel like you'd address some of the racial inequalities and be an advocate for racial justice in our community?
Okay. So it's an interesting concept that I've run into, because I've had people say, well, John, you represented South Tampa before, and now you're coming up to the rest of, the other 3 districts to represent the whole city. Well, the reality is South Tampa voted for me 2 different times, in 2003 and 2007. But once I got sworn in, it was my duty and obligation and honor and privilege to represent every part of the city. And every single vote that I took for the next 8 years was on behalf of the entire city. I never neglected any part of the city. I worked with Sean Harrison, who used to be the representative up in the New Tampa area. When Sean said, we need to build a firehouse, a fire station up here because of all this growth and development, or, that sort of thing. He got my vote, because it's important. When in Forest Hills, when Babe Zaharis was, residents were deathly afraid because the Sports Authority was spraying really poisonous chemicals in their backyard on the golf course. I was the one who stood up and started asking the Sports Authority and those chemical companies about their research and the effect of those chemicals, and we actually got them to back down. So those are just 2 examples, but I've always been a strong advocate, for everybody in the city, because, like I say, once I was a council person, I was a councilman for everybody, and the only difference now is everybody has a chance to vote for me.
Right.
But in terms of my attitude, will not change. The same thing in East Tampa. I'm no stranger to East Tampa. I taught school in right on the edge of East Tampa in Ybor City. And as a public defender, I've represented many, many people from East and West Tampa, and North Tampa for that matter. People who can't afford an attorney got me. And as a result, I know the conditions. I understand the conditions. My students lived in those conditions. My clients live in those conditions. I'm no stranger to it at all. There's a lot of racial issues under the surface in our community, which I think nobody's really been willing to talk about for too long. And it's not just the disparity, in terms of living conditions and that sort of thing. To me, it's also just about communication. I don't think we get together and communicate. Many years ago, Reverend Tom Scott, who was not only a wonderful reverend in East Tampa, but also former city councilman and county commissioner. But he and I gathered up my rabbi and his, members of his, different churches in East Tampa, and I think we even had a priest or 2. And we would get together for lunch and just to communicate, because we felt like, well, if we can start communicating among ourselves as city councilmen, as clergy, and that sort of thing, then we can take that and expand it out into the community. And we did that for a couple of years, and unfortunately, it kind of petered out a little bit. But I think, to me, that's where it all starts. We have a racial divide in this community, and and one person can't, solve it. But one of the candidates for Mayor Topher Morrison, I've heard him speak to this issue very eloquently. And he said that sometimes he's embarrassed to be a white man in the city of Tampa when he looks at some of the conditions that he's seen in East Tampa. And frankly, I would concur with that, to a certain extent. But he had the courage to say it, and I give him credit.
All right. Well, I don't want to shortchange our listeners, but we are kind of getting near the end of our allotted time. So is there anything else that we haven't talked about, that maybe there's something in your platform or in your candidacy that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Another ordinance that I drafted myself, and I have the skills and training to draft things myself, and I run them by the city attorney because that's their job to make sure I dot the I's and cross the T's. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I came up with was, I looked a lot at these a lot of ranch houses that we have around the city, and they're nice houses. They're 1,000 square feet, 1,500 square feet. Ranch houses that were built in the 50s or 60s, cinder block houses. But front porches were sort of falling out of vogue during that period of time. Mm-hmm. In other parts of town, like Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights,
bungalow
Hyde
style
Park, you have a lot of bungalows,
right.
And you have a lot of front porches because they were built in the 20s and 30s before air condition, when people valued their front porch. So that's where they went out to get a little fresh air. They didn't stay locked up. But once air conditioning came around and we had these cinder block fortresses, people said, "What do we need a front porch for?" That's an extra $300 to our budget. Well, what I wrote was the City of Tampa front porch ordinance, and got it adopted without much objection from council. There were some neighborhoods who objected, but that's another story. But so what we got successfully passed basically was an incentive to new construction and reconstruction to either add a porch to an existing house or build a porch onto a new house. And some builders don't even want to build porches even onto these new houses. You see these big giant, what do they call them, McMansions, and they put like a little 3-foot faux porch. It's totally not functional.
Right.
Well, the reason I advocate for front porches is not just for the aesthetics, but it's a neighborhood thing. Mm-hmm. When you sit on your front porch, and your children or your dog or whatever is playing in the front yard, your neighbor's sitting across the way and their children are playing in the front yard, and you have this community, a building of community. And from a law enforcement perspective, cops love it because now you've got eyes on the street. So there's multiple reasons that front porches are successful all across the country. This ordinance, I've been told by the building department, has been very successful, and it's been used by hundreds of families, either for new construction or for reconstruction. And what it does is allows you as a homeowner or a builder to encroach into your front yard setback up to, I think it's about 10 feet toward the street, but only for the purposes of building that front porch. And you can never enclose it. So we're not allowing people to to rig the system and say, "Oh, I'm going to build a front porch and then I'm going to enclose it and I get additional space, in my front yard." No, that's not allowed. But anyway, so I know it sounds like a silly little thing, but again, it's just something that I was proud to be part of it. And now when I drive down the street and I see somebody taking advantage of that and building, a front porch on the front of one of these, concrete ranch houses, it just makes me feel good because I think it makes our city a better place.
And it shows your dedication to community.
If you say so.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the election, March 5th.
Correct.
I ask everybody, when does early voting start?
The absentee voting, my understanding, my wife tells me, she keeps up on these things, starts in about a week.
Vote by mail.
Yeah, vote by mail. Mm-hmm. And then the early voting at the precincts, I think, is only unlike in the fall, which had 2 weeks, I think, of early voting. This one is only a week of early voting, like at the main libraries.
Sure. So how can people get involved with your campaign? What's the best way?
To go to our website, johndingfelder.com.
Could you spell that?
I can. It's JOHNDINGFELDER, johndingfelder.com. Go to our website, or they can email me directly at john@johndingfelder.com. and we get right back to them. We can get them yard signs. I'm out walking door to door, knocking door to door. We're going to be making phone calls, doing all the traditional stuff. And then if they enjoy social media, they can, blast out on social media and talk about the things that I stand for.
And can they contribute to your campaign then?
They can, right there on www.johndingfelder.com.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much to our listeners. I'm going to go ahead and let you know that if you ever want to give us comments or feedback, you can do so by emailing me at Vaughn, V as in Victor, AUGHN, the number 30 @gmail.com. And thank you so much for coming on, being awesome. Our guest. We're really trying to help our listeners kind of engage. It's hard to figure out about local politics and all the local candidates unless you can make it out to a forum. So we try to make it accessible for people.
Well, any voter in the city, registered voter, can vote in the city election. We encourage them to vote in the city election. Turnout is traditionally low for the municipal election, which is unfortunate. It
is, yeah.
So, and people forget how important their city government is.
Even if they don't live in the city affects them, like you were saying.
Oh, totally. But unfortunately, only the city residents can vote. But I encourage everybody to get out and vote. Even if they're not voting for me, just get out and vote.
And I think I've told people when they say, how do I know if I live in the city? I say, check your utility bill. And if it goes to the city of Tampa.
That's a good question. I think some county residents pay to the city of Tampa.
Do they?
What they need to do is look at their voter registration card. The voter registration card will tell them if they're a city resident.
Well, that's much more common sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. We've gone way over our allotted time, but it was worth it. And again, we appreciate all of our listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. This has been Reclaiming My Mind. I'm your host, Jessica Vaughn. And thank you for listening.